Good evening and welcome to the April 10, 2019 meeting of the City of Lake Forest Plan Commission. I'm Rosemary Kerr, Chairman of the Commission. At this time, I would like to ask members of the Commission to introduce themselves, starting on my far right.
Susan Atkinson.
Michael Freeman.
Monica Ruggles.
Steve Douglas.
And from City staff, Ms. Cerniak, Head of Development, is here this evening and will be making a presentation later. Due to the length of the last meeting on March 13th of 2019, the Plan Commission meetings are not yet available, but will be available for consideration of approval at the next Plan Commission meeting. And some of you may be new to attending these meetings, and I just want to highlight a few basic structure of the meeting that we use. I will ask the Commission members to declare any conflicts of interest and ex parte contacts at the beginning of each agenda item, and tonight we have one item. We will swear in all parties who are intending to testify, so if any of you would like to testify or feel you may want to testify, please fill out one of those sheets and hand it to Kathy Cerniak. Then we'll have a presentation this evening by Kathy Cerniak, representing the city, not to exceed 20 minutes, and that will be followed by questions and requests for clarification from the Commission to the petitioner or staff in this case. After which, the public testimony portion of the program will open, and we ask each speaker to not exceed 5 minutes. Therefore, we can hear comments from a number of members of the community. After that, the public testimony portion is closed, and it is up now to the Commission members, an open meeting, so you may listen in as we have final questions from the Commissioner to the staff in this case tonight. And our agenda item is introduction and opening of a public hearing for consideration of an update to the chapter of the city's comprehensive plan relating to the Waukegan Road, Settler Square Business District, and the surrounding area. No Commission action is requested at this time, and we will have Kathy Cerniak present. Prior to Kathy beginning, I'm going to ask if any Commission members have any conflicts of interest or ex parte contacts.
None.
All right, seeing none, Kathy, please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Kerr, members of the Commission. This is really the beginning of what will be a fairly lengthy process. The City Council has directed an update to the city's comprehensive plan. That comprehensive plan was last adopted in total in 1998. There have been a number of incremental amendments to the comprehensive plan since that time. There was a study of the Route 60 corridor done in 2002. The transportation chapter was amended to incorporate a bicycle master plan a few years ago, and the environmental chapter was amended a few years ago to incorporate sustainability goals. And there was also an amendment done a number of years ago related to Lake Forest Place. So it is appropriate in about 20-year intervals to look at the comprehensive plan in its entirety. The way this review is progressing is that the council has identified a process that directs us to review chapters in phases, so that we won't wait 12, 18 months for full adoption, that chapter by chapter, essentially, proposed updates will come before the Plan Commission for deliberation, discussion, modification, public comment. You can forward a recommendation on each of those chapters to the City Council. The City Council would then act on those. Shortly after that, the Council could direct that we do some implementation of those chapters, but the theory is that once we get through the various chapters, that the last phase of the work will really be going back and aligning the chapters. If there's any areas where there's conflicts, perhaps looking at sustainability goals and weaving those through the comprehensive plan in a more integrated way. So again, this is the start of a long process. What is before you tonight is simply a working document, a framework for you from which for you to begin your discussions. This is unlike a petition where it's not before you to say vote it up, vote it down. This is really your document. It's going to be your product. So what's before you was created with the assistance of an advisory group, a working group that was appointed by the mayor, 8 people. And you have information about the process they followed and who those people were in the materials that were presented to you. But they really, the council wanted that additional piece of the process to increase community awareness, to provide more opportunities for community members to be engaged, and again, to really give you a framework from which to start your work rather than starting with a clear slate. In your packet that you received, you also received the current chapter for the Waukegan Road Settler Square Business District that's in the comprehensive plan. So you have that for comparison. You also have a map at your places that really reminds you of the existing uses in the area. It provides some information on densities in some of the residential areas, Pine Oaks, Lake Forest Chateau, the villas, and one other, the developed Wood Creek Courts, or Woodland Courts behind Sunset. So just to step back for a moment, the comprehensive plan is different than the zoning code. The comprehensive plan is a guiding document. It doesn't establish regulations. It really is a document to help guide policy decisions, to help guide decisions about development proposals that come before you, and to help guide amendments to the zoning code. Theoretically, the zoning code, the regulations, the specific provisions in each of the zoning codes should align with the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan establishes that high-level vision, but doesn't say a setback has to be 10 feet or a density has to be 2 units an acre. It really looks forward to say, what if some property becomes available for redevelopment? Or in the case of vacant property, how today, or looking forward for the next year, next 20 years, how could that property best be developed to support the surrounding uses and for the long-term good of the community? Really looking at it not only from a land use perspective, service delivery perspective, financial perspective, social equity perspective, environmental perspective. So the comprehensive plan, again, is that high-level document. And just to go through some kind of key attributes or key goals of the comprehensive plan, it identifies future opportunities. It doesn't mandate. Sometimes people look at the plan and say, well, there's already a use that's different than what's proposed on that site. The comprehensive plan doesn't mandate change, but it looks forward so that if a property becomes available, there's some framework, there's some forethought into what should that property be if things change. The comprehensive plan should identify challenges so that the city council perhaps can think about those challenges and addressing those perhaps through decisions related to funding infrastructure or working with neighboring communities or working with the state. Comprehensive plan really is a tool that should be used both by current property owners and developers who may be interested, potential buyers. It helps to set forth the vision of each area as developed by the community. As I said, it establishes a framework for considering development proposals, so you're not picking new concepts out of the sky or making incremental decisions that really aren't thought through as far as their long-term potential impacts. As I mentioned, should guide policy decisions as well as budgetary decisions made by the city council. And again, as I mentioned, shape decisions related to infrastructure. So again, keeping in mind that difference between what is a comprehensive plan, after the adoption of the updated comprehensive plan, it's my expectation that The council will likely direct us to go back and perhaps look at some rezonings of some property, or even relook at the text or the description of specific zoning districts if it's determined to be appropriate. You all, I know this is small on the screen due to the configuration of it. I know the commission all has this packet before in your hands. If you haven't picked it up, there are copies in the back of the room. And I'll also note, if you want to speak tonight, it would be helpful if you fill out a form so that we get your name spelled right and your address correct. And if you did not receive a direct mailing about this meeting and want to in the future, please sign up on the interested parties list. So just to give you an overview, this first phase of the comprehensive plan deals with the Waukegan Road and Settler Square Business District. Waukegan Road runs north-south through the area. The railroad tracks run north-south through the area. Everett Road, the Everett Road and Waukegan Road intersection is a heavily traveled intersection. Waukegan Road is a state road. Everett Road is a local road. Just to orient everyone, again, Waukegan Road, Everett, this is Sunset, Forest Square, Conway Road. This is the city fire station, the train station, Lake Forest Chateau, Colony Square, and this is the property currently owned by Mr. Stewart, St. Patrick's Church, and St. Mary's School. The colors on this map represent the designation, the land use designations, not zoning, but land use designation as recommended in this first cut at a working document. To look at those a little bit more specifically, they are each separated onto the later pages of this document. As the working group met with interested parties from the community as they had their discussions, a couple themes came out of their work. This area is a transportation corridor. Heavily trafficked Waukegan Road, heavily trafficked railroad tracks, those do create barriers in getting people safely across those areas. The group talked about the need to increase density in the surrounding area in order to support the desired variety of businesses. We often hear there's too many banks in this area, too many service businesses. We recently had a restaurant open in that area, Little Tails, and I'll give a pitch right now. It's a family restaurant, and it's one of those opportunities for there to be a restaurant use in this area, but it only survives if people patronize it. So the discussion revolved around really looking at ways to provide flexibility in the land use to allow, as I said, some increased density, but also, if and when some areas change, to even allow an opportunity for mixed uses, to allow a combination of office use and residential use and retail use and service businesses and restaurants. There was also a lot of discussion about how to increase pedestrian connections to and through the area, to do that safely. Again, there are some obstacles in this area, as there are for all areas. Waukegan Road, there was an interest in really slowing traffic down through that area. Certainly, a number of years ago, we were successful in having IDOT reduce the speed limit a bit. There's interest in further discussions trying to reduce that further. And you see some of that reflected in the document. Looking more specifically at some of the areas, this area includes Sunset, includes the property owned by the Archdiocese, the property located on the southeast corner of Waukegan and Everett Road, and the property located on the southwest corner of Conway on Waukegan. That area, again, in this document, is proposed to be designated for mixed use. As I said, to really provide the opportunity to share parking, to create pedestrian connections, to provide office uses that perhaps bring in employees that support restaurants or retail, to even bring in residential or provide the opportunity for residential as things change in this area over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. The triangular area located on the west side of Waukegan Road, really kind of hemmed in on all sides by Waukegan Road and the railroad tracks, was identified to really be a focus of commercial. That area didn't appear to be appropriate for mixed use because it's not ideal for residential use. Discussion about really looking for ways to encourage connectivity through the area, walking paths, shared parking, in the overall business district, to look for ways both at the south end and the north end to let people know they're coming into a business district, whether it's entrance signage, whether it's some consolidated or consistent signage along the street, in a way that we can work with IDOT to get approval for, but really looking for ways to link this together and recognizing that the business district, if it's to be successful, can't only be supported by residents in the immediate area, but has to be a business district that draws from the larger community and even draws from those who pass through it on a daily basis. The area located west of the railroad tracks is identified in this slide. It is all city-owned property, again with the fire station at the south end, the train station in the middle. As the group discussed this area, first noticed that it really is an area that should be used to satisfy parking demands within the larger area. It's already surface parking lot. If as a result of some increased density, there's an increased need for employee off-site parking or increased commuter parking, then the thought was perhaps the lot north of Everett Road could be decked in some way, either below grade parking, some above grade parking. Could that, over a 20-year period, include perhaps some small service or small scale retail to serve train commuters? Perhaps even the thought that there could be some small scale residential there as well. But again, looking for flexibility, looking for more opportunities than the current zoning provides. The south side of Everett Road was really talked about as remaining as a parking lot. This area here is very close to the railroad crossing. In fact, scheduled to begin spring of 2020, the Waukegan and Everett Road intersection will see some improvement. One of those improvements will include extending a left turn lane on eastbound Everett, a right turn lane on eastbound Everett to facilitate right turns onto Waukegan. Right now, it's really difficult if you're turning left or going straight. You're really blocking that opportunity to make that right turn. So there'll be some reworking of this, which will actually take a portion of the city properties. But to have any access in this area, vehicular access, was not recommended because of the proximity to the railroad crossing. There was discussion as part of this plan, really looking at some infrastructure improvements that would enhance the pedestrian crossings, make them more noticeable, whether it's lights, whether it's signs, whether it's some different treatment in the pavement, but recognizing that because this is a commuter station, we really need to look at those safe crossings, not only there, but throughout the area. Looking to the northwest corner of Telegraph Road in Everett, there is a parcel owned by the city. That parcel currently is land banked. It's essentially being held in the event that additional parking is needed at the train station to support increased commuter traffic. As the working group looked at this site, they saw other opportunities. Again, they saw the potential to address parking within the area that already is surface parking, and perhaps using this site, and it's one site where the group didn't come down on a hard conclusion. There was a portion of the group that felt that moderate density residential was appropriate on the site. Others felt that commercial was appropriate on the site. The property, interestingly, is currently zoned B1. So it is currently zoned for commercial, despite the fact that it's disconnected and on the west side of the tracks away from the other commercial area. So that's a property that would benefit from some discussion by the commission along with others. Another property that was looked at, there's a 10-acre vacant parcel, not completely vacant. It does have 2 houses on it fronting right on Everett Road. There are actually 2 long and narrow 5-acre parcels. The 10 acres is in a single ownership. It's on the south side of Everett Road, just to the east of Lake Forest Chateau. That property is currently zoned for 60,000 square foot lots. Although we've seen a number of proposals through the years, the group really talked about the fact that, number one, there are enough acre-and-a-half lots throughout the community, and number two, this property does not lend itself to being developed in a quality way with acre-and-a-half lots. So the group recommended that we really look at a change that would allow this to be developed by right at a moderate density as we look at a transition between Lake Forest Chateau, the villas, and Colony Square, and the acre-and-a-half lots to the east. You do have one graphic in front of you does provide density information. Lake Forest Chateau is 4.5 units to the acre. The villas, which is the condominium buildings, are 12 units to the acre. And Colony Square, this area here is 6 units to the acre. So looking at the opportunity to build the density, increasing residents in the area to help support the business districts, perhaps, even though this hasn't been discussed in the past, perhaps there's an opportunity to integrate some development either with Lake Forest Chateau and/or with Colony Square to really create a development that has appropriate access, has appropriate pedestrian connections, and really fits well onto that site, which is clearly a transition parcel. Just again, review of the process to date. This is before you tonight for an introduction. Really would welcome your questions, your requests for additional information, areas where you want further study done. The staff recommendation is that you would continue the public hearing tonight, not take any action. I don't expect we're going to have answers to all your questions. I think we'd prefer to take your questions and come back to you with detailed responses. Once we will continue to refine this document, it will come back to you. You will continue to hear public comment. Once you are comfortable with the document, you would forward it to the City Council with a recommendation. The City Council would then consider this chapter, take action on it, and then, if appropriate, direct some changes to zoning or amendments to the code, either in the short term, or they could decide that they want to wait until some other chapters are completed. So that concludes my initial overview. I'd be
Thank
happy
you.
to answer any questions, but I'm going to transition over there.
Thank you, and I do want to thank the members of the working group with Mike Edelman as chairman and group members Richard Sugar, Eileen Luby Weber, John Cortese, Jack Frigo, Dennis Mulmans, Bob Shaw, and Stephen Douglas on the Plan Commission here, and appreciate their opportunities to speak directly with residents of the Fourth Ward. And now is the time for commission members to ask for questions or clarifications from staff, and I'm going to ask Commissioner Douglas if he would like to make an initial comment about how your meetings went with residents of the Fourth Ward.
Well, I think it was a great process, and we had a big turnout at virtually every meeting, lots of participation, particularly in a couple sessions where we had big tables set up with with large-scale plans of each section on the tables, and people were invited to actually draw, you know, their ideas and so forth. And a lot of great things came out of the process. I will say I'm a huge fan of the multi-use, the transition to multi-use, because I think, you know, bringing multifamily into this area is going to make it a lot more vibrant and help the retail survive better. You know, I think there's, like Kathy mentioned, there's some discussion to be had on the parcel that's owned by the city. And I guess my personal view is that, you know, it's too far west to attract a commercial use, but we'll see. So all in all, it was a great process with a very good start, I think, for the commission's work that lies ahead.
Well, thanks for your participation on the working group. And I'm going to ask Commissioner Douglas to start with any questions or clarifications from staff.
I believe I had ample opportunity to do that in all of our committee meetings, so I am right on board with Kathy on this. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Commissioner Freeman?
Thank you. So Kathy, help me with the multi-use portion that Steve was just telling us about, or Commissioner Douglas was just telling us about on the east side. Will zoning become part of this discussion? Will the multi-use remain B1 zoning? Is that something for the Plan Commission to be discussing at one of our next meetings? Just help me understand the process.
The comprehensive plan establishes land use designations. So it doesn't mean that the zoning has to be changed immediately or ever. It really provides the opportunity, if some land becomes available, that it could be considered for mixed use. However, it's likely, because there's such a large area of this chapter that's being recommended for mixed use, it would be reasonable, if the council so directed, that if this plan or this designation for that particular area is approved, then it would be reasonable to think that the council would then ask the Plan Commission to relook at the B1 district and see how that may need to be amended in order to support mixed use, or maybe look at creating a new zoning district. But look at, that would be a later phase. If this land use designation is approved, how does it get implemented? How do we pave the way for someone to come in and develop in a way that's consistent with this plan?
Because if I look back at the plan that was done for Settler Square Business District back in March of 1998, you know, by example, if we look at the St. Patrick's, where ultimately the church was built, and then St. Mary's School, it's still zoned R2 residential, but according to the 1998 plan, it was meant to be private institutional. So it seems like the zoning need not necessarily change in conjunction with the plan.
That's correct.
Okay, and I think, you know, just a bit of a comment here, it would be, I would be in favor of that. I worry a little bit that the current recommendation leaves us with really a very small business district. I mean, if we were to change the zoning, we would be left with this very small section on the west side of Waukegan Road, and it's not even all the way up to Conway, and currently it's dominated by banks. And so, you know, as someone who lives on the west side of Lake Forest in the 4th District, or 4th Ward, and I'm in the shopping center several times a week, I would find it as a 4th Ward resident a little unsettling to think that I'd be left with 3 banks and no retail. So, and we often get a reputation of not being very open to business. The whole point of a B1 district is that businesses need not come before this commission every time they want to open. If they fit within the criteria of a B1, that business is already approved by the city. So just a concern that I have that zoning not change so rapidly, and you know, I understand the concerns that the group had, and I think it was great that Mayor Lansing and the city and this ad hoc committee spent this time on it. And I do think, we are going to need more residential to support retail. So I favor it. I hope that, you know, it's meant to look forward 20 years. Let's not foreclose businesses in the meantime. That would be my,
And keep in mind, as we said, the zoning doesn't need to change, but the zoning could change in a way that specifies that a certain portion needs to remain commercial, or the first floor needs to remain commercial. So if mixed use is a way you want to go, whether it's for this area or if the commission decides to make the mixed use smaller. Again, this is just a working document before you. But your concerns, I think, could be addressed through discussions about zoning, that could really set some specific, whether it's 50% of the square footage or, so I think your concerns are.
yeah, and I think the plan can send a message to developers that we're open conceptually to a mixed use, but remain B1 to allow for businesses to develop if they can in that corridor, because it is, as I said, it's really the only place we have to go, and I would rather go and shop local than have to drive down to Bannockburn and spend my money there. So let's talk a little bit about these transitional areas. The one to the east of the Chateau and the one on the northwest corner of Telegraph and Everett, is the idea that that would take on some kind of a similar transitional, greater density kind of housing, but not to the extent that the Chateau is?
The property on Everett to the east of the Chateau, yes, it was talked about as, what's the transition? How do you appropriately move from one density to a much lower density? There was, again, the property on the northwest corner of Telegraph and Everett, there was a difference of opinion on that, exactly how it should be treated. So could those end up being designated for a similar moderate density land use? They could, or it could be something different.
Right. So, yeah, and the one right now is zoned 1.5 acres, but it's such a long, narrow parcel. And I think the density, I mean, technically, the Chateau has the same zoning, although it must have gotten it, I think through litigation, it got a special use or something. But the density there, I think, going into 1.5 acres, we'll have to figure out some kind of transition that doesn't allow for that level of density, I would think. But again, I very much appreciate the work the group did. I think that's my general questions for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just respond to one thing on that? Was that the group, in talking about mixed use, we never intended to reduce retail at all. In fact, we thought that by the addition of residential or more office above the retail, we would end up eventually attracting even more retail than exists today, just making the whole thing a lot more vibrant than it is today.
Thank you. Commissioner Athenson.
I have a few questions for you, Kathy. So it was interesting to get the last comprehensive plan and read their ideas and their suggestions, which I thought were really spot on. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like they were really implemented in this area. So I guess my question is, I know you said that this is really a guiding principle for development, but how do we ensure in the future that our comprehensive plan and all this work we're doing on how we envision what goes on in the future is adhered to in the other boards? Because I can say when I was on BRB, I never remember hearing anything about the comprehensive plan when we talked about this area. So I'm just wondering, how do we make that a working document as we flesh out this area and prevent the things that happen on this side that none of us like and that don't help the district?
Incorporating specific regulations into the zoning code. However, there's a balance there too. You want to, the working group again emphasized flexibility. So I know one in the comprehensive plan as it exists today talked about the buildings coming toward the street and the parking being behind. And that was a topic when Forest Square was built. There was a lot of discussion about that.
Brought that up.
And, you know, balancing aesthetics and that goal in the comprehensive plan with what's functional and how does the site work. So again, it's a vision. We're not always going to achieve the vision, but if there are very specific and reasonable aspects of the vision, they can be documented in the zoning code, and that's really the best way to assure that they're going to be achieved, because then a variance is required, and that requires discussion. But again, it's a careful balance between being open enough to encourage commercial development and limiting that.
Right.
There's
But
no
if you-
easy answer.
If you think, I know, because it's a balance, right? And you don't really know how to predict the future totally, and you don't want to be restrictive. But if you think about that whole development with Forest Square, I remember distinctly asking to put the parking in the back to make that building more pedestrian-friendly. And because this whole area is so auto-dominated, and I think we all agree, we want to make it more pedestrian-friendly, so people will frequent the businesses more often. And I never heard anything about the comprehensive plans advocated for that. It would have helped me with my argument a little bit more. But the developer was saying that they wanted to give more visibility to the businesses in that shopping center. So that's why he couldn't put the parking in the back. You know, and now you have all these shopping centers with dominant pavement in front and more autofocus as opposed to pedestrian. So those little tweaks in there, I mean, if I had the comprehensive plan in front of us and said, well, you know, you should refer to the comprehensive plan, this is where it comes from, this is our vision for this area, it would have given more strength to us to encourage a developer to do it in the correct way that we see in the comprehensive plan. So just a thought, as we really think about this, how can we make this a tool for the other boards that really are dealing with the nitty-gritty of, you know, developments when they go in here, or changes in this area? You know, even the development of when the banks popped up along Western Avenue when I was on the BRB, and that was a battle, but there was nothing to guide us on what else should be there. Just a thought, I just want to make sure that we can see this as a tool that we can use in guiding development in the future, that all boards can use, because I was never really aware of it until I was on the Plan Commission. All right, so, and then, let's see, what else do we have? So you talked about the future road improvements that are planned, and you mentioned something about a tunnel, or somewhere I read, a tunnel in the future going under the railroad tracks. I mean, we're talking really far out, right? It's nothing in the future, in the near future.
That is a project that is likely to be discussed more in depth by the council in the coming months. The discussion of an underpass, preliminary engineering plans, looking at some costs, more preliminary engineering plans. That is something that's been in the works for a while. The
That's a
council has
pedestrian
not.
one, right? You're talking,
Pardon me?
are you talking the pedestrian tunnel?
Pedestrian tunnel,
Okay.
yes, sorry.
That's fine.
So that is not something that has been given the green light by the council, but it is something that they will likely talk about. But it is, again, a piece of that, how do you make this area more pedestrian friendly and utilize the parking, and again, it's a balance. But there may have been a reference, I know as part of the working group, there was a long-term vision that there would be a vehicular
Right.
underpass under the railroad tracks. That, yes, that would be a long way out.
Okay. It'd be really helpful.
It would also really require a lot of land. The church wouldn't be there, or the rectory, and so it would really,
Wow.
that's probably longer than a 20-year.
Yeah, and is it worth it if you're taking part of the rectory? Yeah. Wow. Let's see, what else do they have here? So that's all I have right now for questions. I have a lot of comments, but that's all I have for questions. Thanks.
All right, thank you. And now Commissioner Ruggles?
Kathy, I just wanted to verify, for the B1 district, that would still allow residential use, like on the second floor of the properties, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
But again, the zoning could change or be amended as a follow-up to the comprehensive plan.
Okay, so even if it's a relatively small business district, we could still have, you know, this residential mixed-use kind of component on the west side of Waukegan Road. Okay. Has there been any future or current property owners in the area that have expressed interest in having the zoning on their property changed? I'm kind of thinking, if somebody wants to come and develop their property and they want, you know, perhaps it to be a mixed-use property, but there is something in the zoning that's sort of limiting their ability to develop the property, or is there something that we as a board can do to help provide more interest in developing this section of town?
Yes, I think looking at language in the comprehensive plan to provide more flexibility is important. And then, once the comprehensive plan is adopted, following up at the council's direction with amendments to the zoning. Again, it could mean the B1 district goes away and it's something else, or the B1 district language gets changed. So that's exactly what this process is about, is looking at what to change and how to change it.
Is it possible for this area, like where Sunset Corners is, to kind of redevelop that lot, to have out lots so that, you know, there'd be a small coffee shop or something on more of the street side of Waukegan, so that we could begin to sort of hide the parking behind some of these more urban buildings?
The comprehensive plan can encourage things like that. Obviously, properties still are in private ownership, unless the city's going to condemn it and develop it on our own. There are some limitations, and certainly parking demands. There needs to be adequate parking in some form to support development. It doesn't mean it all needs to be surface, but in order to do anything other than surface, to do some kind of a deck parking, that's an economic issue that, so yes, that's certainly, those opportunities are there. And if there are, there's language that you feel we could put in here to encourage that, those are the kind of thoughts that I think would be helpful for the commission to deliberate.
That's all my questions for now.
Just a couple of questions, Kathy. Seems like most of the Fourth Ward residents would like to see more retail establishments, and given commercial real estate demands, you would have to have more rooftops, more density in this area, which would suggest more multifamily, and there's only one lot here, the 10-acre lot off Everett, where it might be considered. Short of rezoning it, could the commission make a recommendation that they would give strong support to an appropriate multifamily development on that site?
Certainly, any kind of language that you want to consider for any of the particular areas, the land use designations that are recommended here and the narrative can be modified or expanded or changed in any way. So yes, that's part of this whole discussion. This is really opening it up for wild ideas, and you know, at the end, some of those wild ideas probably get brought in a little bit, but it's balancing the creativity, and we do hear that people want more retail and restaurants, but at the same time, we know that retail and restaurants have had trouble surviving in this area. Again, there's a new restaurant there that we'd really like to encourage people to go to so that it remains. Additional retail and restaurant will probably generate more traffic, and we have heard concerns from some people about too much traffic in this area. So it's a tricky issue before you, balancing the various interests. But that's what this process is all about.
Well, and with most of the surrounding area already developed, there are limited options. To look at this afresh with the railroad tracks, you'd consider a transit-oriented development, which with more of a concentration of multifamily than what we would see here today. And perhaps some first-floor retail and 1 or 2 stories of residential above it, as Commissioner Douglas was mentioning before. Which brings me to my next question, walkability. Because I didn't see where sidewalks or crosswalks were listed on this. And much to my surprise, as I surveyed the area the other day, there are ample sidewalks everywhere throughout this area. The crosswalks, it's a bit difficult. Some are simply a couple of parallel lines that should be repainted. Others may fall under IDOT, but it might be helpful to have crosswalks that were more noticeable, not just to the walkers, but to the oncoming traffic who may not have gone through this area before. So the roundabout way of asking about the Everett Road intersection, which is up for some construction next year, that is one of 2, along with the Gloucester crossing, that actually has buttons for pedestrians to push so they can get across the street safely. Is there any way to improve that, working with IDOT, because what they have control over Waukegan Road, don't they?
They do, and again, if there's specific language in the comprehensive plan, that can direct the council to establish policies or direct, for instance, the city engineer or others to pursue initiatives with IDOT. So any of those aspects that affect this area that are important, we want to make sure they're clearly detailed in here so that they can then be implemented.
Well, and your suggestion that asking IDOT if they'll consider reduction of the speed, although that is 35 at that point, but somehow make it clearer that there are pedestrian crossings, maybe uniform blocks of white, and obviously as they redo that intersection, a lot of times the white has left, and I think for some drivers, they may not realize it's a crosswalk area there, and that is one where people may be walking across the street to catch a train. Just thinking if we can improve the walkability, add some multifamily units, it does give additional support for some retail in the area. My last question, has there ever been any thought given to having signs on the southern part of Waukegan Road and the northern section saying now entering Settlers Square Historic District?
I believe there is a suggestion in the draft that speaks to perhaps entrance signs for the area. So that is, again, something that the working group talked about, really ways to identify this as a cohesive business district and letting people know that they're entering an area where they need to slow down and perhaps stop and shop or eat.
Okay.
I have a question following up on that. So Kathy, anything in this area, is anything considered historic? Is St. Pat's Church considered a historic structure?
It certainly is a historic structure. I don't remember off the top of my head if it's locally designated or not.
And what about the rectory?
Again, historic structure, I don't, but I can certainly check to see if it's locally designated. I just don't remember.
When we were considering the car wash, the pastor at the time had indicated it had an historic designation, but
I don't know if it's local. It may have a national register, but I can check and get back to you on that.
And so, Steve, I'll ask you this question. Anywhere in this district, does it talk about the history of this area? Is there any kind of...
Anywhere in the document?
There, yeah, well, anywhere in this area, is there any kind of signage or indication of any kind of history in here?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. And I just bring this up because this is a very historic area for Lake Forest, and I don't know if many people are aware of it. And I can give you some comments later, but this is where the Irish Catholics first made their living. I mean, my family goes back 7 generations, and their first farm was where St. Pat's Cemetery is. But you wouldn't know that. There's nothing indication. I mean, I was part of that movie Finding Deer Path, and no one had heard about that whole history. It's really significant here because St. Pat's was one of the first Catholic churches in the state of Illinois, and St. Mary's became its mission church. But no one knows that. It's really something that could really, this is the character of the neighborhood, and no one knows about it, and something we really should think about when we're developing this area. And also maybe, you know, making St. Pat's a historic structure and then developing from that character. Just something that I want you to think about, because if you're Irish Catholic and you're in Lake Forest, your family came from here. Your Redmond, Rafferty, Fagan, they're all still here. So it is a really historic area town, and we don't really seem to recognize that.
One follow-up question, if I might. Kathy, are there any environmental restrictions where the old gas station and Pasquesi property are that would prohibit the kind of, you know, that kind of combination residential, commercial?
It's reasonable to expect some cleanup of that site will be required, and it may be determined that residential is not appropriate for that site.
Yeah.
So that's a good question. I don't know the answer.
Okay. Just something to think about as we, you know, think about changes in zoning. You're putting a, you know, unfair burden on the landowner if they can't remedy that, you know, if it's not fit for the use, given its historic, quite a different historic nature to the property across the street, but just to, you know, something to keep in mind. Thank you.
And importantly, when the group talked about mixed use, and Commissioner Douglas, I think you hit on this a little bit, the group wanted to be clear that a land use designation of mixed use did not require a mix of uses. And again, if that designation moves forward, a zoning district could be written in a way that in order to have residential, there has to be a mix of commercial. So it wouldn't be a mandate that there has to be residential, depending on how it's written.
Kathy, in the materials you sent us, this 10-acre parcel off Everett Road, the suggestion was also made of possibly using existing roads through Chateau or Lynette Drive to give a secondary access to that site. Is that something that the fire department would prefer, to have two access points?
Certainly, the fire department always prefers to have two access points. The notion of could there be some connection, some development that really integrates with the adjacent really came from the working group. So it wasn't discussed at length. But again, if that's a direction that the commission would like to see pursued, it could be more clearly stated in the description of the area.
Well, and the other point in the favor of considering something like that is, in several places, it was noted there might be some drainage issues, so the less impervious surface, the better. Any other questions from commissioners to staff? Okay. Then we will proceed to the public testimony part. Will all those who would like to give testimony please stand up so I can swear you in? No brave souls tonight? Please. Oh, you do have some, okay. Thank you. And are you one of these folks?
I didn't sign in, so I can.
Okay.
You're fine.
Okay. So if all those who have requested to speak, would you please stand now? Jerry Jakes?
Oh, I think he left.
Jax? Okay. Yogi and Asha Gandhi? Would you care to say? No?
My question has been answered
Okay.
for the most part, with the discussion.
All right, then. Sir, do you solemnly declare and affirm, could you please stand? Thank you, that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to your best knowledge? I do. Would you please come to the podium and state your name and address?
My name is Mike Adams, and I'm a Ward 1 resident, and I operate a business in Forest Square. And I don't really have any testimony, but just a recommendation. When I'm heading south on Waukegan to turn into my office, a lot of times traffic is blowing by me at 40 miles an hour and much, much faster. Some folks are actually on their phones as well. So the idea of having police patrolling the area, I think would slow things down and, might help with the pedestrian traffic as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other requests to give public testimony? Yes. And do you solemnly declare and affirm that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to your best knowledge? Would you please state your name and address?
Deborah Fisher, I'm a realtor in town, and it's not testimony either, but just for those who, we've talked a long time, and I've sat in on some of the comprehensive plan discussion on this area. A lot of people have been talking about the desire for more vitality and everything, and just if you weren't aware of it already, we have done 3 pop-ups. Well, we have our 3rd pop-up planned for this weekend. They're all at the West Train Station, so the idea was just sort of let's throw an event or a couple events and see if anybody comes to them. They're all been volunteer driven. First one was on wellness, generated about 125 people coming out. The first one was wellness and fitness. The second one was volunteerism. So about 30 volunteer organizations in town from Rotary and Kiwanis and much smaller ones sent representatives. We ended up with about 175 right before spring break. And then this is the 3rd one. It's a foodie fair. So there will be organizations. So we're kind of trying to marry commercial and community. And so this one will be this Sunday, April 14th, 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock. And we've got a ton of interest on Facebook and things like that. It's purely no budget, just trying to, host some events. And this one, we're expecting at least 175, probably larger than the last one. So if you are available, you can kind of see what the train station looks like in a different entity, when it's filled up with people and kind of alive. So anyway. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for that information. Okay, seeing no further questions from the public or comments, we'll move to the final questions from the commission to petitioner or staff, in this case, both, tonight.
And maybe if I could just clarify, if there is, again, this is intended as an introduction to get you thinking, to hear comments from the public. If there is additional information you need, Chairman Kerr, I heard you talk about pedestrian connections. We can certainly add a sheet that identifies existing sidewalks, potential connections. If there's questions that we haven't answered, I heard some comments, and I could redline the document and add some comments and get that to you to have you look more closely to, do more wordsmithing. But if there's, what do you need before your next discussion? That's really what would be helpful to the staff at this point.
Any other questions?
No questions.
Okay, then let's proceed to commission discussion and comment. And the question is, that I'll pose to all of you, do you want to consider this area as a whole? Do you want to take each of the different maps and land use designations that were provided to us and speak about them one by one? I'm open to comments on how you'd like to proceed.
I have fairly limited comments. I think I could probably just hit the different areas. I'll try and do that in order, though, so that we keep that discussion going, instead of just circling back around, if that's okay.
Sounds good?
All right, so I think of the transitional property areas, I kind of spoke to that already. I think that, I do think the area that is across from the train station, the city-owned property on the northwest corner of Telegraph and Everett, I see a need to treat that similarly to this 10-acre parcel that's over on the south side of Everett, to the east of Waukegan Road. I mean, I think the density of the chateau requires some kind of transition as you work your way towards these 1.5 acre lots. I don't know, it would be helpful, I think, Kathy, to get some help from the city attorney and potentially, you know, others as to how you can interact with what are private roads, essentially, right, on the neighboring property, and to what extent can you leverage those private drives to feed the neighboring property? I mean, I'd be interested to know what limitations we have, because again, if we're gonna start talking about zoning changes, we wanna be careful not to make this even more landlocked than it already is, because it's pretty landlocked. And I think, you know, envisioning a density that would be somewhat similar to that, you know, for this parcel that the city owns across the way. And I think that kind of takes you out of the business district and then into the residential. And I think there's to me at least, there's a similarity there. On the mixed use piece, I would like to think a little bit more, see if we can't get some guidance, Kathy, on how to improve the document in a couple of ways. As it relates to opportunity area number one, the commercial area, again, I'm concerned that it's dominated by banks. I don't know that there's really much that we can do about it, frankly, at this point. I do worry, the new restaurant that you mentioned, you know, the previous plan talked about trying to front the businesses, and I think originally there was a retail establishment that was kind of had reached approval, I think, at some point, even finally, down on where the old gas station and Pasquesi property was, and it was going to front the street. I think that's a brilliant idea. I think the problem for the restaurant that's in the corner of that development over there is nobody sees it. They drive right by it, and it's just not something that's very accessible. So I like the mixed use idea. I don't like the idea of changing the B1 zoning, at least in the short term. I think we could do more in both opportunity area number one, the commercial area, and this mixed use area, particularly those that front Waukegan Road, to encourage some kind of mixed commercial residential. So whether that's, you know, retail establishment with office space above, whether that's retail establishment with residential above, something like that, you know, that would encourage it. It would be a dramatic change of what's there now, though, and I don't know that there's a developer that would have an interest in it. But if the purpose of this plan is to kind of be more forward-looking and improve kind of the pedestrian traffic along this space, that big stretch of parking lot, particularly given the grade differential between the street and where the parking spaces are, just doesn't encourage a lot of interaction in that area. So.
Which parcel are you talking about now?
Sunset
Greg?
property. So you've got this grade differential between where the sidewalk is and where the parking is.
yes.
And so if you had, you know, just envision, you know, if you had something like, as you could drive into Deerfield, or you drive into some of the other downtown areas where they have retail and then residential right above, that encourages walking. It fronts the street. The parking is all behind the buildings. It's just a totally different feel. And if what we're doing is trying to think, you know, bigger, long-term, what creates vibrant, the current layout does not encourage pedestrian traffic. Because as you said, you probably were surprised to find that there's such beautiful sidewalks over there, because nobody's ever on them. Right, nobody's ever on them. So, because unless you're walking from the train station to someplace else, you're not using those sidewalks. And the only thing that's gonna change that is, so I don't in any way mean to imply that I'm somehow discouraging the B1, because I think the city needs to do a better job of telling developers what they can do without having to go through 8 or 9 different committee hearings. I think that we've got to figure out a way to draw people in and make the rules clear and let them develop. So I'm a big fan of the B1. I just think in the current format, it's going to be very hard for us to turn that Sunset Shopping Center into a walkable area in its current form. So something that would help us describe that a little bit better, carry forward some of the thinking that was there in 1998. The other thing I think I'd like the city engineer to do is talk to IDOT about ways in which you can transition the speed limit. You know, again, I think of downtown Deerfield and how the speed limit changes so far ahead of where you ultimately reach the downtown area. And Waukegan Road, in addition to the fact that it changes direction, right? So you're coming down that curve, and I think people are used to doing 45. They see the 35-mile-an-hour speed change, but they're in a curve at that point, and it just does not slow traffic sufficiently. And it's such an open stretch between Waukegan and Half Day that people are going to, I think, be inclined to go a little faster. There's just nothing there's no speed barrier there. And if we want them to be going 30 when they're in front of Sunset and actually see the shops that are there, you know, we're gonna have to slow them down a little further ahead. And I think it's a safety issue for me as well. But it's definitely, you know, and I think you have to do that on both approaches, you know. And if there was something, I mean, I would be a fan of, I mean, I'm Irish Catholic, but I'm first generation, so, to the country, not just to Lake Forest. So I think something that would give a historic feel or a sense of community to that. I mean, I like that storytelling idea. I like the idea of community development through your department, Kathy, and the city, helping retailers find a place here, you know, that they can call home, that has a sense of, you know, community, would be a great thing too. So those are my comments.
I just want to respond to, you raised two issues in Deerfield, and the Deerfield area of Waukegan and, I can't think of the name of the other road. Is it Deerfield Road?
Yeah.
Okay, so that was developed decades ago, as opposed to Sunset. So Sunset is definitely a newer type of development, and it does seem to parallel what's across the street with Forest Square. And being a shopper at Sunset, there are times when that whole lot is full, and we've had to go over to other areas. I would be curious to see what the parking ratio is there, but I would think they did not have room for any out parcels at that lot. Commissioner Douglas might want to comment on that, given
Yeah, I'd
his
agree.
experience, the one across the street.
I think you're exactly right. And Forest Square is woefully short on parking as well.
And the idea of having this parking behind the stores as opposed to in front, generally I've found retailers to want people to see where they can park, or they don't think there is a place to park, and so they don't choose that location.
Well, I think if, you know, ideally you would have parking along the street as well as parking behind, like you do in Libertyville and parts of Deerfield and other communities. So, so that the occasion, and like we have on the east side of Lake Forest. So, you know, and then we have overflow lots, basically. But as somebody said, it's kind of too late for a lot of this, except for way down the road when things get redeveloped. So, but we can concentrate on the undeveloped parcels and at least try to start those along the right path.
And just a comment, given the fact that Everett and Waukegan is going to have some changes to that intersection, if there's anything we can do, and strongly recommend, to improve the viability of that site for current landowner or future landowner, it would seem that there is at least a nucleus of some smaller lot zoning around there to encourage people to perhaps frequent walking to that site might help.
I think downtown Libertyville is actually an excellent example of what this street could potentially be, since Libertyville is also on Milwaukee Avenue, which is a drive-by type of street. I think where they're successful, well, for one, it's old and historic, but they kind of create this downtown area, like with the street lights, they have different lighting. I think we could improve maybe the crosswalk, different paving to make it look more historical, bring in maybe the colors of St. Pat's Church or something to unify this district, because it's just not cohesive. And I think to get around parking is like what Libertyville does. They have these parking lots in the back. So, you know, when you're going to, you know, some of the restaurants on Milwaukee, there's no parking in front. You have to go around the back and go through the back door of some of these little shops or restaurants, and that's what makes that area unique. And I agree, there's not much we can do with some of these developments. I mean, Sunset's the way it is now, but Sunset's not always going to be there. I mean, there's only a certain amount of time that this development's going to stay, right? Then it's gonna readapt, and when it readapts, that's what we want in the comprehensive plan, like, oh yeah, let's make this more street-friendly, pedestrian-friendly, and just unify it somehow, because right now, everybody just drives by, and I don't know that there are many vacant areas here anymore. There's the vacant area, you know, where the Pasquazzi's is, but the rest, I think is all pretty much full, right?
Couple of occupancies at Sunset, I noticed today.
But there's really no vacant parcels, other than,
Right.
you know, so.
And then the difficulty with the parking is, of course, the railroad tracks, so it's easy to park on a weekend, say, at
Sure.
the train station, but it doesn't really help you get to all of the retail commercial establishments.
Right, unless you had some kind of awesome pedestrian bridge, right, that carried you, you know, over, you know, Waukegan Road and to a destination, like, you know, a shopping lifestyle center that, you know, is all popping up all over the place. But that's what we need. We need the residential, the people down there that are down there all the time that have to kind of walk from place to place. And that'll bring in more, you know, businesses, I think. And the little restaurant is a great place in Forest Square. Been there a couple times, and it's highly recommended. You have to visit these places if we wanted to survive.
Any other comments from commission members?
I guess I met last one. So I have a lot of comments. They're kind of all over the place, and so I'll just kind of talk about them. I really liked the document you came up with and the recommendations, Steve. I think you're all spot on with what you and we're envisioning in this area. I think the key here is really mixed-use development, because if you think about and I think Libertyville is an awesome example of, and they've worked really hard to get to that spot. I think Deerfield is not a great example because, once again, they put the parking in front and they kind of built these giant, like, retail and office buildings that kind of dwarf the historic neighborhood behind it. So I don't think Deerfield was really successful in terms of their redevelopment downtown. But I think Libertyville has been, because they kind of honor what their existing character was and built on that and kind of enhanced it. They deal with the parking in a great way. They built a garage behind there that's kind of set in a little bit. You know, there's an elevation grade, and it doesn't really, it's, you know, it's next to a historic area, but it's really a little bit inconspicuous compared to what it could be. So I'm a really big proponent of mixed use because I think that's what's missing here to support these businesses. If you go back to the whole new urbanism idea of like the traditional square surrounded by apartments on the top and retail on the bottom, you go to the city of Chicago and it's vibrant in neighborhoods because people live above the businesses and they support those businesses. That's what's missing here. We have really big homes on the outskirts, but there's no pedestrian connections to support this little restaurant. It's really hard to just walk over there and have dinner. You have to drive there. But if you had apartments above there that could also, you know, help with our affordable housing issues, you could have people just going downstairs to eat. You could have people crossing the road just to go and eat. So I really think we should think in terms of mixed-use development, meaning residential and retail. And I think given what's happened with the past comprehensive plan, we really have to be more diligent in spelling that out in our zoning. Because now we see when we are not specific in our zoning, what happens. We got a bunch of banks, and the banks create dead space. There's no pedestrian traffic. Everyone drives to the bank, or you do it online. There's nothing that adds to this area with just all these banks there. And we struggled on the BRB when all these banks were coming in but we had no tools to stop it or encourage better development or better buildings. There was nothing in the zoning or our ordinances that prevented that from happening. So I think we really, if we're gonna go with the multi-use, which seems to be, or mixed use, that really is a way to support businesses in this area, is get residential mixed into this area. We really need to be more specific on our zoning with that.
A follow-up question to you, Commissioner Athenson. The two parcels that would currently be available seem to lend themselves primarily to residential. They're too far from the core to really be mixed use.
Well, maybe we rezone it. You know, maybe if we look at this one where, I mean, if we're thinking in the future.
Well, I guess the point is that rezoning wouldn't work for those parcels, residential or multifamily,
Oh, the
but not
transitional
retail.
ones? Yeah. I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about the core business ones here. I mean, the transitional ones, the
Where would you
one,
put a parking lot or a parking deck? Because I don't see available land.
well, I'm talking if they are redeveloped in the future. I mean, you know, the whole Sunset development is, you know, it's an older development. Who says it's sold in the future and another developer comes in with a different plan? Who knows? I mean, you put, like, if you move the building closer to Waukegan and you put the parking behind with an elevated garage built into the elevation change, that might work. That's what they did in Libertyville.
Or even think beyond it, look at the size of the lot that Lake Forest Bank and Trust is on now. I bank at the local banks too, I don't, but, you know, given the density of banks in our community and the changes in the industry, you know, there's a potential that you could have that entire section all the way north of St. Patrick's Church and make that a true historic, you know, talk about taking the history of St. Pat's and moving it all the way through. You know, there's a possibility. So I think if the idea is to think big and have a vision beyond, you know, to look forward 20 years, I tend to agree, yeah. And I was mentioning Deerfield more, not because of the density, but or the layout, more so the traffic. I mean, they do a very good job of slowing traffic before you enter that downtown area, and we need to have some kind of a transition there. I tend to agree, something that's more historic, that lends itself to, you know, make it, you know, like we have such a wonderful downtown area on the east side. It'd be great to have some, you know, historic grounding here on the west side too.
And, you know, let me talk about that traffic for a minute, because we did, when I was on the building review board, we kind of looked at, there's a beautification project on Waukegan Road. And we had a visioning, like, a couple meetings about what do you want Waukegan Road to look like. And of course, we were just brainstorming, and then the limitations of the state road came in, and then all our ideas couldn't be implemented. But one of them was a really easy one, maybe not, I shouldn't say that, it's a state, but putting a traffic light in on Conway Road, because then you have another pedestrian connection. The senior cottages are right there. There's another shopping center, and if you put a stoplight at Conway and Waukegan, that slows the traffic down. That's another pedestrian crossing. Another idea.
I think that's in here too, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it is.
Yeah.
They did recognize that. So another idea that we talked about, and this is kind of radical, so don't freak out, but we were talking about putting like planters down the middle of Waukegan Road, kind of like what they have on Michigan Avenue, just to give some kind of more landscaping, you know, something more friendly, and to slow the traffic down. Because, you know, if you come across a barrier, you're going to slow down. Now, I'm not saying, you know, we're brainstorming here, so I'm not saying what the problems are with that. But it was an idea that we floated a while ago that, you know, you're coming from high speed from the south. How do you slow the traffic down? And then you're going high speed again. So maybe if we put a physical barrier down the middle, that would prevent any kind of pedestrian crossings that you don't want, right? You know, like kids running across the street. And so then you would have designated pedestrian crossings.
Yeah,
there.
the state's your biggest barrier, literally.
Of course it
there.
is.
Right.
But, you know, we can be persistent. And it was just an idea of how to make that more pedestrian-friendly and less traffic-oriented, slow the traffic down. It was one thing we did talk about years ago. Because, you know, now we have sidewalks there, and that was another thing we had talked about. There were no sidewalks. Part of that process came the sidewalks and the trees and the parkway. So you're starting there, but, you know, you could also allow businesses, if you set them back, you could have more patios next, instead of parking, you have patios, then you have the building, and then you have the parking. And that makes it more pedestrian focused and less vehicle traffic. And when, when you're driving by and you see people sitting out there, you're gonna slow down.
So should that be encouraged?
I
To
think it
have
should
some
be,
outdoor
absolutely.
eating areas?
Yeah, and I think that's in the plan too. And I want to kind of go back to the whole, like, what if we looked at the old comprehensive plan and what they envisioned for Settler Square was a great idea. It was more of like a Market Square redo. But the problem is that you don't have a single owner with that. You've got one bank here, solid bank, no pedestrian traffic. Now you got another bank, no pedestrian traffic, so that space becomes dead. And so the whole idea of, like, Libertyville has its town square and has a library on the other end. You don't have, and they're surrounded their square on that busy street with retail on the bottom, offices or residents on the top. So in the future, maybe we rethink about how we zone that Settler Square. If we are going for a square-type atmosphere like Libertyville has, you could always also put like a satellite library. If we're gonna get the tunnel going under there, how about putting the satellite library out there, which could be a destination for a lot of people on part of that square, whether it's on the train side or somewhere in that area that people are gonna pull into that square and make parking spaces there, like you do, with Market Square. You could revitalize that whole square. But I think if you're gonna try and control what types of businesses go in there, whether they're pedestrian focused or just dead space service organs, you have to look at your zoning pretty, you have to be more specific on your zoning, because otherwise you'll just get solid brick banks up and down there.
So you mentioned Libertyville several times, and it seems that that's a downtown area that was established perhaps in the late 1800s, let alone the 1900s. And
But they've been working on it. They have that Main Street group and Guy was part of that years ago, where they were working on revitalizing that and rebuilding and renovating and shifting the parking. It looks like it's been like that forever because they have purposely planned it to look like that.
no, I wasn't referring to that. I was thinking of the on-street parking, which at this point, I don't know if Waukegan Road and IDOT would lend themselves to any on-street parking in Settler Square.
I'm talking about in the little square area, when you pull
Right,
in
okay.
and you
well,
could
that's-
put, the angled parking.
Well, you're talking about a lot of redevelopment, as you said, that's
Yeah, just an idea.
primarily in private hands now. But one comment which follows up on Mike Adams, I was officed in Deerfield for a number of years, and when you're coming down from the north or up to the north, there are always policemen there pulling you over if you have not reduced your speed. So that is something that could be encouraged, to have people reduce their speed.
So another thing I was looking at is there's really a lack of open space here for people, like Parkland. I mean, Everett is down the street, and it's really not connected to this area. So one thing you could do is an idea is to make that big parcel a park and provide some pedestrian and bicycle connections to it. I mean, we did that on the Route 60 corridor when we were having visioning seminars, and we turned what is now Town Line Park, that was slated to be, that was zoned office. And we were fortunate because the Stewart family donated that, but we were able to turn that into a park, which kind of adds some open spaces to that area. Maybe look at the concept from here, where you need kind of some gathering space or something that's gonna draw people, and a park would be a great space in this area somewhere. I mean, the only other open space is that little circle in the middle of Settler Square, that there's really no open space just for people to congregate and hang out.
Yeah, traffic and noise is a real problem, though. I mean, you
Yeah,
have the
it
train
is.
there, and it's just not, it's,
But,
I don't know that it would be a draw from I think if we could focus on some combination of, and this is where we could use some guidance, I think, to your point about helping with the zoning, if we get some guidance, Kathy, on how we could encourage the combination of like first floor retail, residential above, you know, how do we encourage that?
But if you look at Market Square, you've got the train going by it all the time, and Market Square, that little tiny square is always full of people. I walk by it every day and it's full. There's traffic going around it, there's traffic going down, and it is full. You know, the other thing I wanted to say is just go back to the, you know, I saw this at a little town in Indiana, which I just love this idea, and it's called a heritage wall. And it's taking your history of the area and putting it on plaques on the side of a building to provide a point of interest and just to highlight what the character of this area is. And maybe we could think about something in this area, like a heritage wall where you kind of detail the history or have some kind of point of interest that people would visit.
Well, there is the new app for Lake Forest. And is Settler Square included in that app?
I believe it is.
But, I mean, just something for a destination and also to define the character, because if you think about it, this whole area is kind of lacking in, its characters aren't really well defined. What is this area? Is it just a pass-through? Is it just, you know, a bunch of strip malls? This is a significant area that is crying out for its character to be defined. And Settlers Square, they tried that with the last comprehensive plan, but the development didn't follow that character. So,
Well, sometimes markets intervene.
yes, but we are looking at our comprehensive plan and what our ideas are for this, so. And so let the historic nature of this be a guide for development. Let St. Pat's be, you know, your measure of what everything else goes up here. Should we landmark St. Pat's, make it a local historic designation to give this a little bit more impact for this area?
Well, I guess I would suggest that, given what's going on in the Archdiocese right now, that might not be the best plan, since some of the parishes are closing.
Well, I don't think St. Pat's is closing though. Yeah,
We're thinking 20 years ahead.
yeah.
But if I may then summarize, I'm coming up with 5 major points. I'm sorry, do you have any other questions?
I just want to say one more thing.
Sure.
Is that there needs to be some pedestrian connections between all these areas. The train station, Everett School, you know, because Everett could draw a lot of kids into this area. I mean, but it's crazy to try and cross all these, but how do we make it, you know, easier for pedestrians to get around this area and also bicyclists? There's no bike path or anything that goes through here besides all, you know, Everett Road is always busy on Sunday mornings with all bicyclists, but you want them to come and congregate and stay. So how do we make that easier? It is a challenge with all the different transportation busyness we have going on, but
Well, there is sidewalk going out west on Everett that does eventually connect to the bike path. I did see that.
so those are just some of my thoughts.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm coming down with 5 major points, just, which I'll throw out for comment or additions. Seems to be strong interest in encouraging mixed-use development, first-floor retail, and upstairs some residential and/or office. Perhaps more emphasis on the residential to get a nucleus of people that would encourage retailers to be in the area. Also, the next 2 would fall under walkability, to see if it's possible to lower the speed limit through that area, perhaps down to 30, to make it easier for pedestrians. And the third one, which runs into it, is Settler Square identity. Streetlights, particular signage, different paving, or better painted sidewalks, so the pedestrians and the drivers who may not be familiar with the area will definitely see that it's a crosswalk. We do have the walk buttons at both the Everett and Gloucester. Consider recommending multifamily residential on the 2 undeveloped sites, since they seem too far afield to encourage retail, or possible green space for the parcel owned by the city that's west of the track. And then encourage some outdoor eating areas where possible. What have I left out?
I want to read the minutes. We were throwing a lot out.
I think you got it.
Well, because at this stage, this is a meeting where we're not taking a vote, we're not making a recommendation today, but these are the major areas that we would consider for the future. And it's interesting, because I think we have to be practical and look for the next 5 years, and yet also look for the next 20 years. So another possibility would be to say if vacant land becomes available in the area, because that's what we're all talking about, the restrictions are primarily because the land's already used for other purposes. But if vacant land, particularly on Waukegan Road, becomes available, we would encourage a mixed use on that. Any additions anyone would care to make?
I have a follow-up question, actually, that's kind of evolved as we've talked tonight. And I think, now I'm remembering back to some of the meetings, and I had the impression that we were gonna, the group initially would kind of come up with a framework, and then the plan commission would embellish on that and add input and perhaps more detail, but that eventually there would be a process where the staff would actually work with a third-party consultant to come up with the actual document that became the comprehensive plan, because I had the impression at the time anyway that we recognized that at least our group didn't have the expertise, the plan commission might not have the expertise, and staff might not have time or resources to devote to doing this thing justice. So is that still a possibility in the
It
process?
is. As we move through the different chapters, there is the thought that at the end, the last phase would be integrating. And what we really envision is creating a digital comprehensive plan that would have some interactive capabilities. Click on a property that could actually pull up the related zoning. So yes, at some point, as we move forward with the Route 60, in order to expedite that next phase, we actually will be bringing in probably a couple consultants, particularly with some expertise in the areas of the uses that you discussed. So yes, at different points in the process, we absolutely will be bringing in some consultants to assist.
Okay, good. That gives me comfort in, because to your point, the document has to be thorough and, comprehensive, obviously, but it's gotta be enforceable too, I guess. And, so even from a legal perspective, it needs to be done correctly, so.
Because that was the problem with the last one. It wasn't enforceable, right?
And that really goes to the implementation, which would be after adoption, where you'd be going back and looking at some amendments to your codes. That's where the enforceability piece, because a comprehensive plan does not carry the weight of a code.
Zoning can only go so
It's just a
far.
plan.
And the zoning can only go so far, so we're gonna need some input on that.
So, just so I understand, Kathy, so all these recommendations that the group came up with, that we were presented with tonight, are we adding to these, or are we reviewing each one of these, or what are we doing with the information that we read tonight? That we had in our packet?
What I heard, some questions, some further due diligence. Commissioner Freeman had some legal questions that we'll pursue. I would take away from some of your comments that we'd begin to make some edits to this, which we will show in strikeout text so you can see what was changed. But yes, you would continue to work and refine this based on your discussion and further discussions. And
We're gonna continue to discuss this area, or are we done with this area?
the staff recommendation is that you don't take action on this tonight,
Okay.
that this is just an introduction and really beginning your discussion on this area.
Okay.
And one of the comments that was included in the concepts is one mentioned by several commissioners tonight: work towards creating a distinct and cohesive identity for the business district. That can be done in a variety of ways, but
I think the other thing on the part, in addition to the speed limits and how do you transition into kind of more of a commercial corridor here would be if street parking is even an option. I mean, I think it's all removed all the way down Waukegan Road. I can't think of a place outside of maybe till you get to Glenview where you can park on the street on Waukegan. I mean, that they have those parallel spots in the downtown Glenview area on Waukegan. I mean, is IDOT open to something like that? I don't know if that's, but something the city engineer could look into. Thanks again to everybody who came, and thanks to the committee and Steve in particular for your work on this. Really appreciate it.
And I would suggest that a motion to continue it. You're in the midst of your public hearing, which can be ongoing, so a motion to continue would be appropriate.
Move to continue the hearing.
Is there a second? All those in favor of continuing the discussion on an update to the chapter of the city's comprehensive plan relating to the Waukegan Road Settler Square Business District and surrounding area, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The motion carries. Other items on the agenda, opportunity for the public to address the Plan Commission on matters not on the agenda. Seeing none, any additional information from staff? Okay. Then, this meeting is adjourned.